In the early hours of June 6, 1944, a German infantry officer named Klaus Reinhold was jolted awake by anti-aircraft fire over the Cotentin Peninsula. He had spent 3 years fighting in Russia and had come to Normandy expecting rest, garrison duty, a quiet posting behind the Atlantic Wall while the real war ground on somewhere else. Instead, he found himself running through a farmhouse courtyard in his undershirt, trying to understand why the night sky above him was suddenly full of parachutes. He did not know it yet, but he was about to spend the next 11 months learning what happened when the American 82nd Airborne Division decided that a piece of ground belonged to it. This is not a story about heroism the way it gets packaged for the movies. There are no swelling strings here, no slow-motion flags, rippling in golden light. This is quieter than that, and stranger. It is the story of what German officers actually wrote in their own field journals and after-action reports when they tried to explain to their superiors why an American parachute division kept refusing to do what the rules of war said it should do. It is the story of men who jumped into the dark over occupied France with no idea where they would land, and who then spent the next year proving, again and again to some of the most experienced soldiers in the German army, that they had badly miscalculated what they were dealing with. The 82nd Airborne Division traced its lineage back to the First World War, but the division that dropped into Normandy in 1944 was something new. It had been rebuilt from the ground up as an airborne formation, trained at Fort Bragg in North Carolina under a punishing regime, designed to strip away everything except the will to keep functioning when a mission fell apart. Officers were taught to assume the plan would not survive contact with the enemy. Enlisted men were taught to operate alone, in the dark, cut off from their unit, and still find a way to accomplish something useful. The division picked up a nickname during training that stuck for the rest of the war: All-American. It sounds almost quaint now, a marketing phrase from a recruiting poster. To the Germans who met the division on the ground, it stopped sounding quaint very quickly. The Normandy drop itself was a disaster by any conventional measure. Cloud cover scattered the transport planes. Paratroopers came down miles from their intended drop zones, in flooded fields, in trees, on top of German positions, alone in the dark, with whatever equipment had survived the jump. A man might land expecting to link up with his platoon, and instead find himself completely by himself in a hedgerow, with no idea which direction friendly lines lay. By any textbook standard, this should have produced chaos and defeat. Isolated soldiers without leadership, without clear objectives, without the ability to coordinate, are supposed to be destroyed piecemeal. That is what German doctrine assumed would happen, and it is what should have happened. It did not happen. Small groups of paratroopers, often men who had never trained together, organized themselves within hours of landing and began attacking German positions on their own initiative. Reinhold, the officer from that first morning, later wrote in a memoir published quietly in West Germany in the 1960s that the most disturbing thing about the fighting around Sainte-Mère-Église was not the volume of fire. It was the fact that the Americans he encountered did not seem to require orders to know what to do. He wrote that, in his experience, infantry without officers present tended to lose cohesion and purpose within an hour. The paratroopers he faced seemed to generate their own purpose out of nothing, as if the mission itself had been distributed into each individual man before the jump, so that losing contact with command changed nothing about what they intended to do next. The fighting for the town of Sainte-Mère-Église became one of the opening chapters in what would become a long education for the German army. American paratroopers, some of them still recovering from the shock of a bad landing, fought house to house against German counterattacks with a persistence that unsettled veteran units. A German war correspondent traveling with an infantry regiment near the town wrote a dispatch, never published, that survives in archived form, describing the paratroopers as men who fought as though someone had removed the concept of retreat from their vocabulary entirely. He noted that German soldiers, trained to withdraw and consolidate when a position became untenable, kept encountering Americans who simply did not withdraw, who instead absorbed losses and held ground that any rational calculation said they should have abandoned. The causeway fighting at La Fière became a particular point of reference in later German assessments of the division. A narrow crossing over flooded ground, defended by a relatively small number of American paratroopers against repeated German armored attacks, held for days against forces that should have overwhelmed it in hours. A German panzer officer named Georg Aldenrath, whose unit took part in several of the assaults on the crossing, wrote afterward that his men referred to the position among themselves, using a phrase that translated roughly as the crossing that would not close. He wrote that his tanks reached the American positions repeatedly and were repeatedly forced back, not by superior firepower, because the Germans had more of that, but by a stubbornness among the defenders that seemed to increase rather than diminish as casualties mounted. He described watching through field glasses as wounded American soldiers continued to man positions rather than withdraw to the rear. And he wrote that this was the first time in the war he had seen an enemy become more dangerous as it grew more badly hurt. By the time the division was pulled out of Normandy for rest and refitting, it had suffered casualties that under normal circumstances would have required it to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Instead, it was back in combat within months, dropping into Holland in September of 1944 as part of Operation Market Garden, tasked with seizing and holding the bridge at Nijmegen against determined German defense. The crossing of the Waal River by elements of the division, conducted in flimsy canvas assault boats under direct machine gun and artillery fire from prepared German positions on the far bank, became one of the most studied actions of the entire campaign. German defenders, watching the crossing, described it afterward in terms that read less like a battle report and more like an attempt to process something the writer did not fully believe he had witnessed. A German artillery officer, stationed near the northern end of the bridge, identified in later Allied intelligence summaries only by the surname Brandt, wrote that his battery had clear fields of fire across the entire river and inflicted what he estimated as catastrophic losses on the boats crossing toward his position. He expected the assault to break. He had seen river crossings under fire before, and he knew what usually happened when an attacking force took losses of that magnitude in the open water. The attack was supposed to stall, the survivors were supposed to seek cover, and the crossing was supposed to fail. Instead, the boats that survived kept coming, and the men who reached the far bank kept moving forward into his position, rather than pausing to consolidate. He wrote that he found himself in the middle of directing his own guns, unable to fully process what he was watching, because it did not correspond to anything in his training about how infantry behaved under that kind of fire. The bridge was taken. German command in the sector, in an internal assessment later recovered by Allied intelligence, noted that the loss of the crossing could not be attributed to any tactical failure on the German side, but rather to what the report described using a German phrase that translates roughly as an unwillingness among the attacking troops to acknowledge that the attack should have failed. It is a strange thing to write in a military document. It is essentially an admission that the German defense had done everything correctly and lost anyway, because the men attacking it had not agreed to be stopped by the outcome that should have resulted from correct German execution. The winter of 1944 brought the division back into combat once more, this time in the Ardennes, rushed north during the German offensive that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The 82nd Airborne was thrown into the line near the town of Werbemont, tasked with blocking the advance of German armored spearheads driving toward the Meuse River. The men who had jumped into Normandy in June and crossed the Waal in September now found themselves digging into frozen ground in December, facing some of the same kind of veteran German panzer and infantry formations that had learned in earlier engagements elsewhere along the front. To dread the words "all-American" on a unit patch, a German infantry commander, referred to in post-war Allied debriefing summaries by the rank designation of Major and the surname Voss, described the fighting around Cheneux and the high ground near Trois Ponts in terms that echoed almost exactly what German officers had been writing since Normandy. He noted that his men had numerical superiority, armor support, and terrain advantage in several of the engagements, and that by every calculation available to him, the American positions should have been overrun. Instead, his unit took losses that he described as disproportionate to any gain achieved, and in more than one instance was forced to withdraw from ground it had physically occupied, because the American defenders refused to stop fighting even after being surrounded. He wrote a line that made its way into a later American historical study of German morale during the campaign. He said that fighting the American paratroopers had begun to feel less like combat against an opposing army, and more like an argument with a force of nature that had simply decided which side of the line it intended to remain on. What makes these accounts worth taking seriously is not that they are dramatic. It is that they were not written for propaganda purposes on either side. These were internal German reports, private letters, post-war memoirs written by men with no reason to inflate the reputation of the enemy who had defeated them. Professional soldiers, many of them veterans of years of combat on multiple fronts, sat down independently of each other, in different campaigns in different years, and arrived at strikingly similar language to describe the same phenomenon. They kept describing an American unit that did not behave the way infantry was supposed to behave when isolated, outnumbered, or badly hurt. They kept describing soldiers who treated the loss of a position as something closer to a personal failure than a tactical outcome, which meant that conventional methods of inducing a retreat, applying pressure until the cost of holding ground exceeded its value, simply did not produce the expected result. There is a temptation to explain this kind of thing away as superior equipment or superior numbers, but the German records themselves consistently reject that explanation. Time and again, the officers writing these reports note that they had the numbers, they had the firepower, they had the terrain, and it did not matter. What they kept encountering instead was a kind of psychological posture among the American paratroopers that none of their training had prepared them to counter, because it was not a tactic in the conventional sense. It was closer to a culture deliberately built during selection and training back in the United States, in which the identity of a paratrooper became inseparable from the idea that a position, once assigned, was not something you left because things had become difficult. It became something closer to a piece of personal honor than a line on a map. Klaus Reinhold, the officer whose story opened this account, survived the war and was held as a prisoner for 2 years before returning to a divided Germany, trying to rebuild itself. In his memoir, he devotes an entire chapter to a single night near Sainte-Mère-Église, describing an assault his company made against an American position held by a small number of paratroopers who had been cut off from their unit for more than a day. He writes about approaching through hedgerows in complete darkness, expecting to find men who were exhausted, disorganized, and ready to surrender once contact was made. Instead, he writes that his company was met with fire so immediate and so accurate that it was clear the defenders had been waiting, alert, fully prepared, despite having had no resupply, no reinforcement, and no contact with their command for more than 24 hours. He writes that his assault failed, that he lost men he had commanded since the invasion of Poland, and that he retreated through the same hedgerows he had advanced through only an hour earlier, no longer certain of something he had believed without question for his entire military career, that a sufficiently isolated and outnumbered enemy would eventually break. He never finished that particular thought in the text. The chapter simply ends there, mid-reflection, as though the author found himself unable to complete the sentence even years later. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most honest things a defeated soldier can write. Not an admission of German inferiority in weapons or numbers, because there was no inferiority in either. Just an admission that somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the flooded fields around a bridge in Holland, and in the frozen ground outside a small Belgian town, his army had run directly into an idea it did not have a plan for, an idea that had been trained deliberately and systematically into several thousand young Americans who had decided, individually and together, that, wherever they were told to stand, was where they were going to stay. None of this made the 82nd Airborne invincible, And none of the men who lived through Normandy or Holland or the Ardennes would have described themselves that way. They were cold. They were often hungry. They lost friends in numbers that stayed with the survivors for the rest of their lives, and many of them came home changed in ways that took decades to even begin to talk about. What the German reports capture is not a story about supermen. It is a story about ordinary young men from ordinary American towns who had been shaped, through a training process built specifically for this purpose, into something that an experienced professional army did not know how to fight. That, in the end, may be the most accurate way to understand what those German officers were struggling to put into words. They were not describing a stronger enemy. They were describing an enemy that had simply refused to accept the ending the German army had already calculated for it.